Hello and welcome to My Friend the Rainbow Circle. Third episode in one day. I'm trying to make it to 100 by the end of the year, arbitrarily, mostly arbitrarily. This is the first episode today where the dogs are making a cameo because I kicked them out of the backyard in the first episode of the day. And they were sleeping during the second episode of the day. A little bit of Maggie made a cameo. And Seeker's going to knock over the camera. But anyway, so I just watched The Irishman. This is going to bolster my credibility because I'm going to criticize The Irishman because I did not like it at all. And the fact that I have these dogs in my way. Excuse me, there we go. So I did not like The Irishman. But this actually branches off of a couple of different things that I was saying earlier today in the last two episodes. Here's Bo making a cameo as well. This branches off of a couple of things. Stop! You're gonna knock over the camera. Stop! You were sleeping in the last episode, and now you're just gonna cause total chaos. I'm trying to be a credible critic here. I'm trying to be a credible critic because I'm going to criticize this beloved movie that everybody seems to love. Anyway, my main point is actually more of a meta critique, and just in the sense that the whole idea of criticism, I think, is silly in many ways. Because I watched The Irishman, which is this movie that everyone this year seems to love. I've seen it on people's best movies of the year list. A couple of those lists have come out, and The Irishman crops up every once in a while. I didn't like it at all. I think it was one of the worst movies I've seen this year. But what does that really matter? I mean, that's the ultimate thing. Is I found it really boring and tedious. So if I wrote a critique of it, I would say, The Irishman, boring and tedious. I would have turned it off if I had not been curious about why other people liked it. And that kept me going, but that made it more torturous every minute. It kept going and going. But anyway, but I never liked Martin Scorsese's movies. I mean, The Taxi Driver I liked. Taxi Driver. I never liked Goodfellas. Everybody says it's the best movie of all time, but it's fine. Gangs of New York, I liked Bill the Butcher's character, but other than that, I didn't really like that. I mean, just on and on. The Last Temptation of Christ actually might be my favorite Martin Scorsese movie. But what does that even matter? I mean, so if I used to want to be a critic when I was a movie critic when I was in college, when I had given up on fiction writing after getting rejected from governess school. That helps my credibility, right? I fell in love with Coen Brothers movies and Terry Gilliam movies and stuff like that. One of my favorite movies was a gangster movie, Miller's Crossing. I still love Miller's Crossing. But if I were to say, I mean, one of the reasons I gave up on criticism is because I like pretty much every movie. Martin Scorsese was one of those weird exceptions. B, most of the movies I like are supposedly quote unquote bad movies. I don't think there's really a universal category of bad movies, but most of the movies I really, truly, deeply love are what critics would call quote unquote bad movies. So I didn't know if I could ever have credibility. But ultimately, I saw the uselessness of criticism. What do critics even do that's all that helpful? I never really read a criticism and said, I'm more likely to see this movie because of this criticism necessarily. I guess it gives visibility to some smaller movies. So they have this function of increasing publicity or something like that. But does Martin Scorsese need that? I don't really think so. So yeah, I mean, it seems like this useless sort of a thing. I mean, it's an interesting conversation to have, but it's ultimately a conversation of opinions. It's not really a conversation of universality. So just in terms of my goal, now that I have this dog on my lap, my goal in viewing something like that, of course, is partially to just enjoy it, but also to learn about storytelling from it, and be inspired as a storyteller by Martin Scorsese, by The Irishman, what have you, and so what can I glean from that in order to really come up with some sort of universal claim that helps me understand how stories work, and then I can pass that on. That's, how I would view it. But if I were just a basic movie critic and I said, and I gave my genuine assessment of it, and I said, The Irishman was tedious and boring, and it was more unpleasant every minute it went on. I found the characters unrelatable and unpleasant, and I had no emotional responses to anything whatsoever. Some of the shots were pretty, and that's about the best I could say about it. But what good does that do? But I think a lot of the response to The Irishman was framed in Martin Scorsese saying the MCU movies are not cinema. Their films are not cinema. Which, he has vast majority, or much more credibility than I do in making that claim, but it's nonsense. It's a nonsense claim. It's dualistic categorization. So if we go to the Rainbow Circle, this is the first time out of the Rainbow Circle today, in the third shoot. I can't talk today. This might be the problem with doing 3 in a day. I lose my ability to put words together. My third shoot of the day. I'm pretending like this is something cool and official. I finally have the Rainbow Circle. But what's really valuable about a movie, arguably, according to my principle of the Rainbow Circle, is right here in the center, the emotional response that I have. So I would say what failed for The Irishman for me was no real emotional response. Didn't really feel anything for the characters, didn't really feel anything for any part of it. There's some parts that were, the whole conflict of Jimmy Hoffa and Frank and what have you, and, his mixed loyalties. I saw the potential that I could have felt something, so I can understand empathetically why someone else might. So me saying I didn't feel anything, what does that actually matter? It's kind of pointless. So Martin Scorsese is saying, the MCU movies are not cinema. But why is he saying that? Because they're formulaic, I guess. I'm not sure, because they follow this pattern. The theme and variation pattern. And as I said, I'm adamant in the belief that theme and variation is not a flaw. It is a type of story structure that you could do really effectively. The MCU movies do it really effectively. That's on that third level right there, that schematic level. But what he's doing is the same sort of process I talked about last time when I talked about this one critic. This is just a random YouTube critic talking about Sula. And the sort of process you go through when you have an emotional response to something, or when you're trying to figure out your lack of emotional response to something. And I think that's what the critic of Sula I talked about in the last episode was getting at. She just had no connection with the characters. It made her feel things that she didn't enjoy. Just having negative emotions is not, that's the goal of a really good story. But you can have negative emotions for something that you just don't enjoy. I had really no emotions with Irishman. So she was sort of processing, I don't like Sula as a character. I didn't like the story as a character, this other critic. And so she processed it based on all these different steps that I outlined in the last episode. And you could say a similar sort of thing about Martin Scorsese's response to the MCU movies. For him, he just doesn't personally enjoy it, and it's an entirely subjective response. It has no more value than anyone else's subjective response whatsoever. Even if he's an expert in cinema and he's seen thousands and thousands of movies, that has some basic value. But he still lands on this complete nonsense claim that they're not cinema. So he tries to come up with a reason why they're bad. They're bad because they're formulaic. That's not really a real universal. Or whatever is. I didn't even really indulge in what his actual criticism was. and so you go from this post-rationalization. I merely subjectively, irrationally dislike this thing. Here's my post-rationalization. I disliked it because of X. Um, this relates to this universal, and usually the universals manifest. If you look at the outer rim of the rainbow circle, usually the universals manifest as something that's either dualistic, cinema, not cinema. In fiction terms, it's usually literary genre, which is the most ridiculous term ever. In film, it's usually popular versus art cinema, or critically acclaimed cinema versus popular cinema, which is nonsense. The MCU movies, a vast majority of them are critically acclaimed. I mean, they get 90% on Rotten Tomatoes. I mean, you can criticize Rotten Tomatoes as a term of as a form of actually assessing critical acclaim. But it's a nonsense dualism. Um, or hierarchical. Here's my top 10 list of the greatest movies of all time, which is not a real hierarchy. It's just an entirely subjective list. And I've talked about before, I did this with horror movies really specifically, but you could do this with any sort of list of greatest works of all time. So if a lot of Martin Scorsese movies will end up there, like Goodfellas. I didn't like Goodfellas at all. But if you put that on a list, and then I said, what are the greatest movies of all time? And how do I really assess Goodfellas based on my recognition that it's commonly listed as one of the greatest movies of all time? Will I put Goodfellas on there in recognition that by putting it on there, I gain credibility? I've tried to dismiss any of that sort of motivation for choosing anything that I love. Um, or how do I genuinely assess my responses to Goodfellas, knowing just how critically acclaimed it tends to be and how often it tends to show up on these top 10 lists? um, so it's dualistic or hierarchical, and it's categorical. That's another way of thinking of it. So splitting things into these multiple categories, and ultimately the categories are meaningless. um, and I was trying to think of my own. Hey, but I was trying to think of my own top 10 list of the decade. I'm just not really even remembering what came out this decade. Um, and honestly, Guardians of the Galaxy 2. Sit down, please. Guardians of the Galaxy 2. I watched Guardians of the Galaxy 2 many times. And each time I do, I have a good cry. And I enjoy crying. Um, I can look at, here's a basic example looking at comparing Guardians of the Galaxy 2 to The Irishman. Um, I've really felt nothing at all for any of the characters in The Irishman. They're great actors. I'm not saying they did a bad job. I'm just saying all of the other factors. There are plenty of other movies that I've watched with Robert De Niro, and I felt plenty for Robert De Niro. He's a magnificent actor. Harvey Keitel, somewhat less so. But still, a great actor. There are plenty of movies he's been in where I've felt something for him. Reservoir Dogs. I mean, he gives a great performance in Reservoir Dogs. Al Pacino. Dozens of just magnificent movies where Al Pacino's been able to make me, feel all kinds of complex emotions. If you look at The Irishman in direct comparison to, The Godfather, Michael Corleone, very emotionally complex character. I could watch The Godfather, very, very, very long movie. That's one of the, greatest movies of all time that I do enjoy. Not my favorite movie, but I do enjoy it. So I can look at Al Pacino's performance there. He makes me feel all these complex emotions. Al Pacino as Jimmy Hoffa was just a guy shouting a lot, and I didn't really care at all about what happened to him. But he's got so many great parts where he's able to. It reminded me. There's this just forgotten Al Pacino movie. There was just one shot that reminded me of this, where Jimmy Hoffa is speaking in this room. This underrated movie called City Hall. City Hall is not a great movie, but Al Pacino has this great speech, and then I just remember when I started wanting to be a film reviewer. I think I was in college when this movie came out, and I wrote a review of it. But the review was, the movie's kind of bland, but Al Pacino, such an amazing actor, he gives this amazing, emotionally resonant speech. But yeah, I mean, this one I'm not sure what it was, but everybody seemed to be sort of just trudging through their paces, and I didn't. They never really elevated to anything just emotionally resonant, just for me personally, really. Um, but one of the false universals that you could say is that they're unlikable characters, and they really are. They do all these reprehensible things. So I didn't feel anything for Jimmy Hoffa because Jimmy Hoffa does all these awful things, and he's an unlikable guy. Um, but look at pretty much any other great Al Pacino part. What's really all that likable about that? I mean, Michael Corleone, he's sort of resisting entering the family business. And he does have a lot of texture to him. But a lot of what he does is really unlikable. Um, if you look at, any of the characters in Reservoir Dogs I just mentioned, um, reprehensible people in many, many ways. But, what really makes Harvey Keitel, Mr. White, what makes him, an interesting, emotionally resonant sort of a character? He trusts Mr. Orange, and he feels bad that he was shot, and he, tells all these stories. I mean, if you look at, like, one thing that stood out about The Irishman is just the weird sort of balance of the inanities that could have been cut out. Like, there's this whole conversation about fish that was just obnoxious. I don't know what. I mean, so I would watch that. A false universal there would be cut out any dialogue that does nothing to advance the plot. I have actually heard that advice. That's really bad advice. Don't ever listen to that advice. But if I watch a scene like that where they're just yammering on about this fish, um, I would, I would say the post rationalization there might be dialogue that doesn't advance the plot or reveal anything about a character. It's bad dialogue. Um, but then you look at any Quentin Tarantino dialogue. Quentin Tarantino is generally considered the greatest writer of dialogue, and that's most of his dialogue is just randomness that doesn't advance the plot. It reveals the character to a degree, but it's so random and trivial. Um, if you look at like Miller's Crossing, Tommy Reagan is just a deeply unlikable guy. He's just a dark, cold, horrible person. Um, but he's able to elicit emotions. I mean, when he's about to kill John Turturro, there's a whole complex of emotions that. And it's Gabriel Byrne. I mean, it's not that. I mean, Gabriel Byrne's a great actor, but he's not the sort of actor that you always necessarily put in the same league as Robert De Niro and Al Pacino. But he gives such a great performance in that. Exponentially better, if you have, entirely subjectively, exponentially better than, Robert De Niro or Al Pacino do in The Irishman. Um, But one of the things I always remember from that movie is John Polito's character right before he's going in to confront Eddie Dane and Tommy Reagan. He's telling somebody about the best way to shave. I don't know why that always stood out to me because it sort of gives you the. I mean, I think the reason it works is it gives you this texture to the character. He's giving this nice advice. He's not just flatly evil. He's having this, upbeat, pleasant dialogue before he's going to do something extremely violent a few seconds later. And I guess that's kind of how the fish dialogue is supposed to work. It just, just for me, entirely subjectively, it just fell flat. Um, so, my main point being, commonly the problem with criticism, and this goes with any sort of writing advice, and this goes with any sort of response to a text. Commonly, the problem is that same sort of post rationalization I talked about before, where really the only real reason you need for understanding why you didn't like something is just irrationally you didn't like something. There's certain things that you like and certain things that you don't. There are things that are going to hit properly for people, things are not, and it doesn't actually matter ultimately. Unless I'm talking to somebody who has the same taste as me. Well, it doesn't really matter if I didn't like The Irishman, except for it makes an interesting conversation, but beyond that, it doesn't actually matter. So that irrational emotional response that I have to it, or lack of emotional response that I have to it, um, can lead to this post-rationalization and then lead to this false universal that can manifest as a false dualism, like good movies are Scorsese cinema, bad movies are MCU film, or what have you. And that's total nonsense. And so I think in order to understand what good and bad actually means, we need to disabuse ourselves of this basic notion that claims about whether or not something actually qualifies as cinema, whether or not something actually qualifies as universally good or universally bad. Those are just nonsense claims. In order to really understand what good and bad actually are, we need a better understanding of subjectivity, better understanding of how to really effectively process subjectivity, so that when we reach these false universals, we can recognize that's a false universal, that's a false dualism, that's not actually what good and bad actually mean, so that we can have a much better understanding of the basic mechanism of storytelling. There's my there's my rant for the day, I guess. What do you have to say about that, Maggie? Do you like Martin Scorsese? You want to say bye-bye? Do you like Martin Scorsese? I love Martin Scorsese. I love Martin Scorsese too. He's so great. What's your favorite Martin Scorsese movie? Is it The Last Temptation of Christ? Everybody loves that one too. I should do a response to why The Last Temptation of Christ is actually Martin Scorsese's best movie secretly. Based on an entirely subjective opinion by a random person. Anyway, have a good night. I'll see you in the next episode.